Before Facebook was even a week old, it was already in legal trouble. In 2003, the Winklevoss twins hired Zuckerberg to help build a social network called ConnectU, and he agreed, took their codebase as reference, strung them along for months with updates that never came, then launched the Facebook on his own without them. They eventually sued and Zuckerberg settled for $65 million in cash and stock. But what made the whole thing worse was what came out during the case. Leaked instant messages showed him describing his early users as dumb fucks for handing over their personal information, reasoning that if people just voluntarily gave him their data, then that was kind of on them. He was 19 at the time, and it honestly set the tone for a lot of what came after. 4 years later, in 2007, Facebook launched a feature called Beacon, which was built around the idea that when you bought something on their partner website, Facebook would automatically post that purchase onto your profile and show it to your friends. There was no opt-in, no consent prompt, it just did it, and you can probably already see where this is going. One user's wife found out about the engagement ring he'd bought her weeks before he planned to propose. Another had purchases from adult content websites shared with everyone he knew, and these weren't bugs. The feature was working exactly as designed. The whole point was to make your off-platform activity visible to all your social network, which in theory was supposed to feel like social commerce, but in practice just meant your personal purchases were being announced without you knowing. Zuckerberg apologized publicly. The feature got shut down, and Facebook paid $9.5 million in a class action settlement. What makes it stick out though is that the employees had internally flagged how invasive it was before it ever even launched, and they shipped it anyway. Then there was the 2012 IPO, which was supposed to be this massive celebratory moment that ended up being one of the more embarrassing market debuts in tech history. The stock launched at $38 a share and within 3 months had fallen to around $17, cutting the value in half and wiping out billions that retail investors had put in day one. What came out afterward was that Facebook had shared updated revenue forecasts, notably worse ones, with selected institutional investors in the days before going public, while regular buyers were still working off the older, more optimistic numbers. So the people with the most to gain knew the picture had changed, and everyone else had found out after the fact. Facebook settled the resulting lawsuits for $35 million and the stock eventually recovered, but a lot of ordinary people were left holding losses that the larger players had been quietly warned about. Cambridge Analytica. This one is the one most people probably remember, and for good reason, because it's the only one that actually made governments start paying serious attention. A researcher named Alexandra Kogan built a quiz app on Facebook, and when people took the quiz, it didn't just collect data from those users. It also pulled data from all their other friends, none of whom would agree to anything or even knew was happening. That data, covering an estimated 87 million people, ended up in the hands of Cambridge Analytica, a political consultancy connected to the Trump 2016 campaign and the Brexit campaign in the UK. Facebook found out that the breach in 2015 told Cambridge Analytica to delete everything, never actually verified what they did, and then said nothing publicly for 3 years. When journalists broke the story in 2018, it triggered congressional hearings in the US, parliamentary inquiries in the UK, and a $5 billion FTC fine, which at the time was the largest ever imposed on a tech company. Zuckerberg testified before Congress for 2 days, answered every question with patience of someone who knew exactly how it was going to end, and walked out fine. The bigger issue was never really that the data got taken, it was that Facebook had built a system that made something like this possible at that scale, knew about it, and chose to stay quiet. In 2021, a former Facebook product manager named Frances Haugen left the company and brought tens of thousands of internal documents with her, which she handed to the Wall Street Journal. What those documents showed was that Facebook's own research teams had spent years raising serious concerns internally about misinformation spreading faster than fast checks, about the algorithm rewarding outrage and decisive content because it kept people engaged longer, and about leadership repeatedly receiving recommendations to address these things and declining to act on them. There were reportedly an internal study showing the algorithm was directly responsible for pushing users toward increasingly extreme content, and others showing that significant share of vaccine misinformation was coming from a small number of accounts that Facebook had already identified and chose not to remove. Haugen testified before Congress and called for regulation. Facebook disputed their framing, and then about 2 weeks later, Zuckerberg got on stage and announced the company was rebranding to Meta. The metaverse announcement. October 2021 was one of the strangest moments in recent tech history. Zuckerberg stood in front of the whole world and said the future was virtual reality, that people would work and socialize and essentially live inside a digital world, and the avatars he showed to demonstrate this famously did not have legs. Meta's Reality Labs division, which was responsible for making all of this happen, lost $13.7 billion in 2022, and then another $16 billion in 2023. And the flagship product Horizon World had a few active users that the company reportedly encouraged and its own employees to spend time in it just to keep the engagement numbers from looking completely empty. Meanwhile, the stock had dropped about 76% from its peak, and in February 2022, Meta lost $232 billion in market cap in a single day, which remains one of the largest one-day market value losses ever recorded for any company. Zuckerberg eventually called 2023 his year of efficiency, laid off around 21,000 people, and shifted focus back to advertising and AI. The stock came back. The metaverse quietly stopped being mentioned in earnings calls. The Instagram acquisition. This is one of those stories that looks like a win on the surface and gets worse the more you look at it. Facebook bought Instagram in 2012 for $1 billion, which everyone at the time thought was an insane overpayment, and turned out to be one of the greatest deals in tech history, given that Instagram is now estimated to be worth somewhere north of $100 billion. But the founders, Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, had built something that genuinely had its own identity, and from pretty early on, Facebook began systematically pulling that apart. They forced deeper integration with Facebook's data infrastructure, started overriding product decisions, and gradually made it clear that Instagram's independence was more of a courtesy than a given. By 2018, both founders had resigned, with reporting at the time describing the core issue as a loss of autonomy and increasing interference from Zuckerberg directly. What made it worse was that the internal documents later showed Facebook had at certain points actually suppressed Instagram's growth when it started threatening Facebook's own engagement numbers, meaning they had bought the most valuable photo app in the world and occasionally held it back to protect the older, worse product. Internal documents that came out in 2021 showed Facebook's own researchers had found that Instagram was making things measurably worse for teenage girls. This included increased rates of anxiety, depression, and negative body image, with one internal slide reportedly noting that the platform makes body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teenage girls. Teenagers in the research described feeling like they couldn't stop using the app even when they recognized it was negatively affecting them. Facebook had all of this, didn't publish it, and kept growing the platform. By 2024, more than 30 US states had filed lawsuits. School districts were suing, and Senate hearings were being attended by parents of the kids who had died, with testimony directly connecting Instagram's recommendation systems to what had happened to their children. Zuckerberg was at one of these hearings, and at one point he stood up, turned to face the audience and the family sitting behind them, and apologized to them in person. It was a genuinely unusual thing to witness from him. The lawsuits kept going anyway. The weird thing about going through all these is that none of them actually slowed the company down in any lasting way. After every single one of these, Facebook grew, and then it grew some more. And at a certain point, that pattern stops feeling like a coincidence and starts feeling like that's just how the company is built. Leave a comment on which one you think was the worst, and subscribe if you want more of these. Peace.